The man she trusted most opened his arms and pulled her close. Then his blade drove straight through her chest. Blood poured out, staining her thin nightgown red and soaking into the dew-wet grass beneath her. He leaned close to her ear and whispered that all of it was to seize the fortune of House Raroba. Then he smiled, bid farewell to his beloved fiancée, and calmly turned his back and walked away. That night ended the life of Rachel Raroba, but the story has to begin many years earlier. In the waiting room of a wedding, a voice asks the young bride whether she has truly made up her mind. The groom steps forward in his formal coat and says flatly that if she regrets this later, that is her own burden. This man is the Duke said to carry demon blood, the one the world whispers about as merciless and cold. Rachel only smiles and grips his hand, declaring that from today he is the new pillar of her family. Just then, her little brother Rico calls out to her. He is the only blood she has left in this world. Looking at him, she shivers, remembering a past life where none of the three of them survived that year. Her eyes sharpen. This time, she will overturn the board and no one else is going to die. Memory drags her back to the year the monsters came down, took her parents, and left 2 children at a funeral. The little boy clutched his sister's hand, dazed, calling for their mother and father in vain. The relatives immediately huddled together, eyes bright, because the Raroba heir was still small and carried the red-eye disease. Hearing words sharp as knives, Rico teared up and apologized, blaming himself for not being normal like other children. Rachel smiled and reassured him that nothing was wrong, then coaxed the boy off to his room to rest. In this world, a child born with red eyes is thought to be cursed, carrying a miasma that eats the body. Whatever the world said, Rico was a long-awaited child, the treasure of his parents and of Rachel. While they lived, the two of them poured their whole lives into a laboratory, hunting for a cure for their son. Remembering that, Rachel clenched her fists. From now on, she would be the only shelter this boy had. She went to her uncle and aunt to discuss the succession. He immediately picked apart her petition for temporary guardianship. He shamelessly declared that no one would let a girl of 15 lead the house, so he would take guardianship of Rico. Rachel wept when she understood the petition had been intercepted, while they bribed officials through the back door. At that dead end, Viscount Alois Virunia, Rachel's distant cousin, suddenly appeared in the middle of the hall. Seeing her cousin arrive at exactly the right moment, Rachel called his name like a drowning woman grabbing a rope. Alois exposed the forged documents on the spot, pointing straight at the greed behind them, and the old man flinched. He coldly ordered the relatives out, declaring that guardianship was not theirs to take, and he would handle it. Slapped across his own scheme and thrown out on top of it, the uncle choked and could not say a word. Before leaving, he still called Alois a boy with no respect for his elders, then demanded to know why he had come. Alois draped an arm over her shoulder and said he could guess those filthy little schemes with his eyes closed. Seeing Rico peeking around the doorway, Alois smiled gently and waved the boy over to join them. He held them both and said their parents had taught him medicine, so he thought of the two of them as family. His voice warm as sunlight, Alois promised to help her make Rico's cure, hoping the three of them could lean on each other. Rachel choked up at that sincerity and swore she would finish the cure for her brother no matter the cost. With Alois behind her, Rachel carried the house on her back while working on her parents' unfinished research. But even buried in books and herbs, she still could not bring the formula to completion. 7 years passed. Rachel had grown into a beautiful young woman, and she smiled at the sound of Alois at the door. For years, he had not only helped treat Rico, but played her false fiancé to shield her from fortune hunters. Her voice fell as she reported that her brother was failing fast, while Duke Hubert had the same disease and lived to 30. Alois said that Duke killed monsters with his own hands, so he was an exception, and the world always buried records of cursed children. The two of them went into the sick room. Alois asked gently how Rico was feeling today. The boy obediently said he felt better, but in truth he had declined so far he could not sit up alone. This sudden turn for the worse was outside anything they had planned for, and both of them went pale. In the middle of the tension, a maid carried in a tray of steaming food for the young master. Seeing Rico weakly refuse to eat, Rachel coaxed him softly and insisted on feeding him herself. After only a few bites, Rico gasped that he could not breathe, and Rachel cried out for help in a panic. They struggled until they were drenched in sweat before the boy finally drifted off. Only then did they breathe. Alois took his leave, telling her to rest. But Rachel could not settle. because her brother's symptoms were too strange. She frowned, racking her brain over what on earth could have made Rico's condition collapse this quickly. By candlelight, she found strange red spots on his arm, a symptom that appeared nowhere in her parents' records. She went to find the maid Rena to ask about Rico's meals. She did not know what she would overhear by the well would kill her. Walking through the dark, Rachel kept turning it over. Perhaps something had been put in his food after all. Walking on, she stopped short, catching the faint sound of Rena whispering a report to someone in the dark. Rachel pressed herself into the shadows, unable to understand why her own servant was meeting her cousin at midnight. Her knees nearly gave when Alois told the girl to keep going while he was away, adding that Rico would die soon anyway. Still reeling, she watched Alois press a vial into Rena's hand, warning her to be clean about it or Rachel would catch on. He added coldly that no one should underestimate Rachel, because a woman who knows medicine can find a poison easily. The word poison detonated in her ears. Rachel stared, unable to believe it came from the man she trusted most. Horrified, she stepped back. A dry branch cracked underfoot and the guilty pair spun around at the sound. With moonlight full on her face, Rachel stepped out trembling. Alois growled her name, his expression going dark. He demanded to know what she was doing there. Rachel steadied herself and laid out everything about the food and the symptoms. The curtain had fallen. Rachel looked at him in panic and asked, shaking, whether he had poisoned Rico. Tears streaming, she asked how he could do it. All she got back was her name said coldly by a two-faced man. Through the pain tearing at her chest, his old promise of a home for three of them echoed back like a joke. Seeing her fading, Alois knelt down and admitted he had ordered Rena to poison every meal her brother ate. He calmly confessed he had never been a decent man, only one who used any means to swallow House Raroba whole. Rachel gasped his name. He complained that she had ruined a perfect plan to marry her and then be rid of her. He stopped Rena. Rachel's body had to disappear his own way, and no one could ever know how she died. Afraid the girl would leave traces, Alois decided to handle it himself and ordered her to scrub the scene clean. He hoisted her bloodied body up and walked off openly through the rustling of leaves in the dark. Lying in the arms of her killer, Rachel realized bitterly how deluded she had been to think she knew this man. She had believed he was the one decent soul among wolves. Her greatest fear now was that her brother would die right after her. In her delirium, memory returned to the day her father announced he was close to a cure and set off into the dangerous forest. Her mother had stroked her hair then, telling Rachel to take good care of Rico in their place. Discarded in the empty forest, Rachel closed her eyes, weeping quietly for the promise she could not keep. Her body went cold, but the will to live flared. She refused to die meaninglessly in this wilderness. In her final moments, one wish flickered through the girl's mind, that she could begin everything again. A strange light suddenly burst out and swallowed the whole forest, radiating something like the miracle of rebirth. Rachel jolted awake, gasping for air, and stared around her in complete confusion at where she was. She ran her hands over herself and froze. She was alive and the fatal wound was gone. Before she could make sense of it, instinct screamed that a night forest is full of predators and she had to move. The thought had barely formed when a huge monster with bloodshot eyes loomed behind her, and she bolted. Running in panic, she caught her foot on a root and went down hard on her face. The beast lunged like it had been starved for a decade, jaws bared to tear apart the prey lying before it. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut and waited to die, certain her small life was over this time. A single sword stroke split the night and cut the monster in half before it could touch her. Saved by a hair, she opened her eyes in a daze and looked up at the broad back of the man who had appeared. The man turned, monster blood still on his cheek, and called to her in a voice low as stone. He looked down and demanded to know if she was tired of living, wandering into this death forest at night. What struck Rachel then were his burning red eyes, so bright she froze and could not speak a word. He frowned, studying her. He did not know she had just walked out of death and would drag him into her revenge. He pressed her for her name and her purpose, but the shock was too great and she could only stammer. Out of patience, he dropped it and ordered his men to escort this strange girl all the way home. A kind knight explained this was Duke Ghislain Hubert. The name was so familiar that Rachel flinched. The man who saved her was the Duke of Demon Blood, cousin to the king, the only person to survive red-eye disease. Facing the most powerful man in the kingdom, Rachel realized heaven had just handed her a second run at the board. White hair, red eyes, a sword still wet with blood. By the script she knew, this man should have died a year ago. Rachel kept her composure, thanked the men who had saved her, and gave her full name, Rachel Raroba. Hearing the Raroba name, the knights stiffened, unable to grasp why a noble daughter was barefoot in a forest. Judging that lingering here was dangerous, the knight urged the whole party to escort the lady home at once. On horseback, pressed about why she was in the forest at midnight, Rachel admitted she was just as lost as they were. She said she opened her eyes and was simply there, and the knight clicked his tongue, deciding she must sleepwalk. The party reached town to find royal banners everywhere, and the townspeople busy preparing for a festival. Looking at the familiar banner appearing at the wrong time, Rachel cautiously asked a question that sounded absurd. Told it was the 5th anniversary of the king's coronation, Rachel's face froze on the spot. That celebration had passed 2 years ago. One insane thought surfaced. Had she gone back in time? The servants panicked at the state of their lady. At the same moment, a pink-haired boy came running out. The boy called for his sister over and over, then demanded to know where she had gone and frightened everyone. Without hesitating, Rachel threw herself at Rico and held him, eyes brimming because the boy was whole and unharmed. Seeing him healthy, standing steady, his body still warm, she finally dared believe this was not a dream. His sister was in tears, but Rico stayed sharp, pressing her about why she had vanished like that. Rachel changed the subject and asked how old he was, and the 10-year-old scowled at such a pointless question. Remembering that tomorrow was her 20th birthday, she lied that she had gone walking in the woods and stroked his hair. Rachel pulled out her papers and stared. Everything matched 2 years ago, yet her memories of the future were intact. The image of the white-haired man holding her surfaced again, making everything in front of her feel impossible. She shivered slightly and wondered whether that entire tragedy had really been nothing more than a dream. But her instincts insisted the pain was real, and that she had genuinely been sent back into the past. Once she had swallowed that truth, her face hardened, because she knew she still had a chance. Looking up at the stars, she swore silently never to repeat the ruin of her last life. At that same hour, the white-haired man stood with his arms crossed, deep in thought in his lavish room. The knight from earlier reported the lost girl's identity, Lady Rachel of the Marquis House of Raroba. At the word Raroba, he frowned faintly and repeated it, while his man clearly still had something left to say. He cut his eyes at the servant, forcing him to finish the part he had been holding back. Her eyes lit up. If she truly had returned to the past, then this future would be one she drew herself. The next morning, the lady brewed a pot of tea, savoring a rare moment of calm before the storm. She lifted the cup and smiled. She did not know that in minutes the man who killed her would walk through that door. Rico came bounding in with a large gift box to wish his sister a happy 20th birthday. The gift was a glittering glass pen he had designed himself and had made to order for her. Rachel praised it, her throat tight. Rico ran off to meet his tutor, exactly as it had gone last time. Her train of thought snapped. Rachel's face went rigid as if she had just heard an alarm bell. Right on cue, a blond man leaned in behind her, joking that someone had beaten him to the gift. Rachel jumped, said Alois's name, and scolded him for creeping up on her. He only laughed and apologized. Wearing that familiar, gentle smile, Alois held out an elaborate birthday box wrapped in fine silk. Seeing her odd expression, he asked after her kindly. Rachel waved it off, wondering what hid behind that mask. Inside the box was the same pearl necklace as last time, the final proof that the wheel had truly turned back. She was retracing the coming disasters when Alois said her name. Last time, his next sentence put her in a grave. He came straight to the point, complaining that her uncles were rushing to set a date for the family council. Memory of that council flooded back, the great event of the Kingdom of Lagra where dukes and marquises debate policy. House Raroba was large but obsessed with medicine. Since her father died, the relatives had grown bold. Alois played the understanding older brother, wearing a pained look, and offered to shoulder everything for her. But this Rachel was no longer naive. She lowered her eyes, mind racing for a way to handle him. Alois's expression stiffened, and he was clearly thrown a little by his cousin's strange silence. She declined gracefully, saying she had leaned on him too long, and it was time to face the uncles herself. The instant he was refused, the gentleness left Alois's eyes, replaced by something cold and calculating. He recovered by praising how grown-up she was. She answered lightly, warning herself to reveal nothing. Luckily, a maid pushed the door open then, reporting that the outer hall was drowning in birthday gifts. Standing before a hall packed with presents, both Rachel and Alois sighed at what a nuisance this was. The scene was printed in her memory, the season of being buried in gifts and gold-digging proposals. But that was fine. This was her chance to sort out the men circling her family fortune. Alois laughed and flattered her, saying a lady as clever as she was would never fall for such empty tricks. His face slid instantly back into that harmless, gentle mask, as though nothing had happened at all. Without asking the mistress of the house a single question, Alois ordered the servants to haul the gifts into storage. That arrogance woke Rachel up. Last life, he had stripped away her right to decide with exactly this ease. She thought bitterly that he was the one who wanted this fortune most while playing the noble soul. He dusted off his hands and waved goodbye with the ease of a man finishing a pleasant stroll. Once he was gone, Rachel took control back, telling the maids to bring every gift to her room instead. Once that was done, she made an excuse and left, abandoning Alois's pearl box alone on the table. Escaping that suffocating room, she stepped out into a glass garden, green and flooded with sunlight. She reasoned that at the council they would force her to marry a lesser branch, and Alois would play the hero. Last life he had played on her passion for medicine and bravely offered himself as her shield. He lured her with an arranged marriage, urging her to cut back her duties and focus entirely on curing Rico. Back then she agreed without thinking, and brought home the fiercest wolf the whole family had. Piecing it together, Rico worsened exactly when she finished the antidote. Alois had poisoned the boy. Last life, the cure took a full year, but this time she knew the formula by heart, enough to save her brother. Burning with the will for revenge, Rachel pushed open the door into her own luxurious chamber. The moment she entered, she caught Rena admiring the pearls, muttering with envy over that very gift. Caught red-handed, the girl jumped, but Rachel pretended not to see and sent her to pick out a hat. Watching her scramble, Rachel knew this girl adored Alois and wondered if he used that blindness. She should have dismissed her at once, but Rachel played it smarter, praising her taste and handing her the wardrobe. Keeping the traitor close avoided alerting Alois, and busy with dresses, the girl could never near Rico's meals. The carriage rolled out of the estate, carrying her bitter thought about how easily the two of them had been led. To break out of the family's chains, she knew her own strength was not enough, and needed a real ally. That person had to be powerful enough to have no interest in Raroba's fortune. Only one man in the kingdom qualified. The frame cuts to the commanding stride of a man stepping down from a carriage onto the stones. Holding her letter of introduction, Rachel announced herself clearly and asked to see the Duke as scheduled. She was led into a grand but frigid hall, left alone in the middle of a cavernous room. Out of the shadows, the tall, white-haired man walked slowly toward the woman waiting alone in the hall. Rachel did not flinch. She looked straight at him and named Duke Hubert while he studied her carefully. She bowed, thanked him for receiving her, and thanked him again for saving her life in the forest. But the Duke cut her off, said the debt was settled, and coldly sent his guest away empty-handed. Ignoring the dismissal, Rachel shot to her feet and blocked him, saying she still had one large favor to ask. He smirked and mocked how thick-skinned and troublesome the daughter of a marquess could apparently be. Stung, Rachel still forced her nerves down, gripping the fabric of her dress to gather her courage. In that silent room, her voice came out shaking but urgent, pleading with the most powerful man in the kingdom. Then she raised her head and dropped a bomb, asking the Duke outright to marry her. A proposal this far outside anything imaginable left the ever-composed Duke standing there genuinely stunned. Ghislain Hubert was the strongest shield of the throne. Only his red eyes kept him behind a helmet, away from the nobility. Ghislain stood still for several long seconds, his red eyes wide at an offer this reckless. Rachel told herself the spear was thrown. In terms of authority, no one on earth outranked him. Ghislain regained his cold front quickly, refused outright, and pushed her out for fear of trouble. Refused flat, she did not give up, insisting she would certainly be of use to the Duke. She reassured herself that he had saved her once, so under that cold shell there had to be a decent man. Rachel dug in and begged the Duke to stay just long enough to hear her out. Out of words at her stubbornness, Ghislain pressed her into the chair and demanded to know her real scheme. He closed off every exit, declared that marriage did not exist in his life, and ordered her removed. Seeing the chance slip, Rachel played her trump card. Her brother had the same red-eye disease he did. Elsewhere, a retainer was reporting on the audacious girl, Lady Rachel of the Marquis House of Roroba. At the word Roroba, Ghislaine turned sharply to confirm it. The retainer reported on the brother as well. He added that the boy's red eyes were identical to Ghislaine's, and the Duke went quiet for a moment. The retainer also noticed that Rachel had not gone pale at all facing his master's frightening eyes. Ghislaine vaguely recalled rumors of a sickly air at Roroba, then clicked his tongue and dismissed it. He coldly confirmed he knew the situation but said sharing an illness hardly meant they had to marry. Rachel held her ground, explaining she only wanted an alliance of mutual benefit, and she trusted her own skill. He smirked, doubting the ability of such a slight young woman. In under a month, she would be keeping him alive. Rachel laid her cards down, reminding him that Roroba was an old apothecary house with an unusual way of life. She said she had inherited her parents' research on red-eye disease and had even produced a working painkiller. Ghislaine listened in silence. Clearly her words had struck a nerve and stirred real curiosity in him. Seizing the moment, Rachel asked the sensitive question directly. Was his illness worsening and tormenting him? Caught square in the chest, Ghislaine stiffened, brushed it off, and told her she was meddling too much. Rachel calculated. Last life, he died in exactly 1 year, which meant he was already in bone-deep agony. She asked him to fund the completion of her cure. He countered that funding did not require a wedding. Her gaze steady, Rachel shook her head firmly and said what she needed was not money. She spoke sadly of being married off within the family and of her life's work being thrown away with it. Worse still, those blood relatives were counting down the days to her brother's death to swallow the estate. Ghislaine considered it, recalling that Roroba held a basket of medical patents and ranked among the wealthiest houses. Rachel admitted that mountain of wealth was the bait driving the relatives to push the two of them aside. Seeing him waver, Rachel exhaled, relieved he was finally weighing it instead of throwing her out. She risked her last line, asking him to be a screen so she could work on her medicine in peace. She played her final card. When the cure was done, he would benefit too. It was all she had. Rachel worried the relatives had already caught wind of this, so she needed a hard preemptive move. Gathering her courage, she said that if he agreed, in 3 days he should escort her to the royal ball. She begged him to be her partner, her eyes burning with the will to change her own fate. Ghislaine frowned at the word ball, that gathering place for nobles who lived to trade gossip. Rachel knew he avoided such affairs, but she needed a public claim before the relatives could interfere. Ghislaine sank into old ghosts. He knew too well how it felt to be a joke because of his eyes. Rachel knew she was asking too much. If the Duke threw her out in anger, it would be entirely fair. But Ghislaine's face had already darkened over. He ordered his guest shown out without another word. Sensing trouble, Rachel withdrew obediently, giving him back the quiet he needed to rest and recover. Still, she left behind a vial of painkiller with a note saying he could test it or use it freely. Once she was gone, Ghislaine gripped his arm, veins standing out, muttering about when she had seen through him. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he felt lost, unable to understand how things had turned this strange. Her proposal kept repeating itself in his head, and even his frozen heart stirred a little at it. Sweating from the ache in his bones, Ghislaine smiled crookedly at the thought of this sudden marriage. Unable to bear it any longer, he reached out with a shaking hand for the vial she had left. The spear was thrown. Ghislaine tipped the strange vial back, hoping for some peace in his body. It worked almost instantly. He lay back and exhaled, savoring the moment the pain finally retreated. 3 days later, at the Roroba estate, the silence was thick enough to hear a breath. Rachel was radiant in her ball gown, but still uneasy, wondering who she would be arriving with tonight. The maid beside her was just as lost, with no idea how to save her lady from this situation. Rachel began thinking about Reina and Eloise, sensing that side of the board had already started moving. The hours passed and her hope thinned, the partner's seat still empty, and the Duke nowhere in sight. With the hour almost on her, Rachel blamed herself for asking too much and scrambled for a backup plan. A loud noise cut straight through her thoughts and made her spin around toward the sound. The steward rushed in, announcing a guest of rank. Carriage wheels outside signaled someone important had arrived. From the upper floor, Rachel looked down into the hall, her heart hammering as she waited for a miracle. Ghislaine walked in with overwhelming presence, in formal dress, immaculate right down to the last detail. Rewind to the night before when the king was sipping his wine and talking quietly with Ghislaine. The king was delighted to hear Ghislaine had been proposed to, while he silently submitted the petition. Hearing the bride's house was Raroba, the king smiled knowingly, curious what move his cousin was making. Ghislaine answered that he did not care much, since marriage had never been part of his plans. Then he turned serious, saying he could not ignore her research into curing the red-eye disease. The king nodded, recalling the monster disaster 5 years ago when Raroba suffered heavily under suspicious circumstances. An image surfaced of Ghislaine drenched in blood among the beasts, proof that the disaster still echoed. The king admitted he had kept this secretive house under watch, suspecting their hand in the monster affair. He closed with a test asking what Ghislaine would do if ordered to infiltrate and investigate House Raroba. Back in the present, Ghislaine strode up to Rachel, treating the servants around them as though they did not exist. Rachel stared, wondering if his arrival meant yes, though she still could not read a thing in him. That sudden entrance killed the smile on the maid's face, who trembled at a turn this far beyond expectation. The couple's carriage rolled slowly through the streets toward the palace under a full moon. The air in the carriage was thick. Ghislaine handed Rachel a box and told her to wear what was inside. Rachel opened it and froze at the fairy's tear, the legendary jewel glittering almost painfully bright. The day his mother married, the crown had made this stone the inherited dowry of House Hubert. Pale at something so valuable, Rachel stammered a question. He only said to wear it so people would talk less. Rachel understood perfectly. This necklace was made for the neck of a duchess, and whoever wore it ruled that house. Ghislaine said their interests aligned, since who else would ever propose to a red-eyed patient like him? It stung a little, but Rachel obediently offered her neck and let him fasten the glittering chain. Leaning close with a cold gaze, Ghislaine issued an ultimatum before they passed through the palace gates. He warned her up front that he was immune to love, and a proper wedding would not change that. He told her not to fantasize. They would only play the part so far. She nodded, not knowing that was the promise she would most want broken. Rachel felt small remembering her parents' love, but still swore to give him everything she had. At last the royal ball appeared in full splendor, orchestral music drifting through the enormous hall. The instant they entered the main hall, every gaze fixed on the Duke's burning red eyes. Rachel quietly noted the hundreds of eyes on them, but he only told her to let it be. He was used to it. Ghislaine signaled that their first duty was an audience with the king. Neither knew who waited in the corridor behind them. The couple walked straight toward the throne, where the king sat waiting for his honored guests. Rachel curtsied with perfect grace and announced her Raroba name aloud before the sovereign himself. The nobles erupted, stunned to recognize the heirloom jewel at Rachel's throat and to realize a wedding was coming. Ignoring the stunned crowd, the king smiled as if he had known, praised her nerve, and blessed the match publicly. Ghislaine and Rachel bowed together in unison, thanking the throne itself for its open protection. Then a voice rose from behind them, and the peaceful air went rigid in an instant. Rachel turned sharply, reminding herself she could not slip because her enemy was standing right there. It was the blonde man. He scolded her for avoiding him, then feigned shock at an engagement he was never told about. He took a moralizing tone, saying he had always treated her as family and hardly knew how to congratulate her. Rachel's face went stiff as she forced the words out of her mouth. Brother Alois. Alois turned to the Duke and introduced himself as Rachel's distant cousin, Viscount Alois Verunia of the cadet branch. He pressed her on deciding alone and how long they had known each other, and Rachel understood he had studied her circle closely. She thought fast and built a story about getting lost in the forest and nearly dying before the Duke saved her. Rachel played the bashful part while retelling their meeting, and Hubert stood beside her with a face of stone. The Duke gave Alois a cold look, saying the engagement had royal approval, so congratulations were in order. Put firmly in his place, the Viscount sweated, forced out a blessing, and hurriedly excused himself. He turned and walked off with a look of pure resentment, like a man who had just lost everything. Hubert stood there quietly, apparently turning some move of his own over in his mind. A servant hurried up with word that His Majesty was summoning the Duke to meet foreign guests. Rachel tactfully excused herself to fix her makeup. The Duke nodded and promised to return for her soon. The moment she turned away, her face fell. She told herself that every storm eventually passes. Walking the empty corridor, she felt satisfied. With the king behind this match, Alois's side could not stop it. Just as she believed everything would go smoothly, a hand shot out of the darkness and seized her. The man dragged Rachel backward roughly before she could even begin to grasp what was happening. She was thrown down hard onto the cold floor of a room that was pitch black. The man loomed over the small figure on the floor, filling the room with a suffocating pressure. Still reeling, Rachel felt the blood rush to her head as she glared up into his face. The face of her attacker came into the light. It was Dennis Kleber. She demanded to know what he was doing. Dennis was Viscount Kleber's son, a relative who eyed the Roroba fortune. She could not see how a coward dared this. Ignoring her searching look, Dennis shouted like a man unhinged, demanding to know what she was plotting. He sneered at her for clinging to a dangerous man, calling her insane for marrying someone under a curse. Hearing that contempt, Rachel felt both shaken and physically sick at his incurable arrogance. Her eyes turned to knives. He knew perfectly well Rico had the same disease and still spoke like that. Dennis kept shouting, insisting her husband had to come from the family and telling her to wake up. Rachel thought privately that the only reason she agreed to the Duke was how sick she was of his kind. Recovering her poise, she said coldly that Dennis was the one who needed his head examined. She turned to leave, saying he could air his grievances in daylight. She did not know the door behind her was locked. Seeing his prey walking out, Dennis hissed at her to stop and yanked her dress, making her whip around in alarm. Without another word, he threw himself at her like an animal and pinned her flat to the floor. The impact tore a groan out of Rachel, who could barely breathe under his heavy frame. Dennis smirked, a vile little smile, mocking her for still not grasping how wretched her position was. His face came close as he threatened that in this locked room there were only the two of them. Rachel snapped awake, eyes wide in horror, reading his plan. He wanted to manufacture a scandal. Cornered against the wall, she fought back fiercely and screamed at him to let go of her. He clamped down on her wrists, ordering her to be quiet and submit to his filthy appetite. Desperate and pinned, Rachel turned her face away in tears, screaming herself hoarse for anyone passing by. Dennis pressed harder, saying coldly that screaming was useless, since noise was exactly what would destroy the engagement. The door burst open. The Duke appeared out of the darkness, asking in an ice-cold voice what was going on. A close shot of Hubert's burning red eyes pouring out killing intent, promising a grim end for that man. Rachel broke down and called his name, though deep down she was ashamed to be seen in this state. Startled but still bluffing, Dennis shamelessly apologized and claimed the two of them were having a private talk. The answer to that flippant remark was a deathly silence and a hand tightening on the weapon hidden in his cane. A second later, Dennis's face contorted in terror as he took a blow that did not miss. In a flash, Hubert lifted him off the ground by the throat, asking where he found the nerve to touch his wife. Without an ounce of mercy, the Duke hurled him out onto the balcony while he screamed for mercy in front of Rachel. Dennis went over the railing, shrieking, his face drained of color, while Hubert calmly sheathed his weapon. Rachel was still shaking, unable to believe he acted so decisively. He said softly that the fall would not kill him. He added that the screaming had already alerted the palace, and people would arrive within minutes. Leaving the man behind, he turned his attention to the woman occupying his entire mind at that moment. The Duke knelt on one knee and gently draped his own cloak over Rachel to cover her. That gesture made her heart stumble, her face burning as she wondered if he truly worried for her. Footsteps came pounding down the corridor outside, a clear sign that people were rushing toward them. Hubert stood and shielded her, understanding at once that someone had staged this to destroy their wedding. He suddenly leaned down and brushed his long fingers across Rachel's lips, freezing her in embarrassment. He had deliberately smudged her lipstick to fabricate evidence, marks left on his hand and his mouth. The door flew open and Alois rushed in with a look of false panic, calling her name and asking what she was doing. But what met his eyes was the Duke pressing Rachel down onto the sofa, and his panicked act died instantly. Sheltered in her rescuer's arms, Rachel guessed Alois had staged this ambush. But he never had only one piece on the board. Thwarted, Alois fell back on his position as head of the cadet branches, lecturing that this behavior before a wedding was indecent. Hubert looked at him with pure killing intent and warned that a servant of a lesser branch should not overstep. Named directly by his Verunia title in that oppressive voice, Alois shrank back, sweat beading on his forehead. At the height of the tension, screams rose from the courtyard below, announcing that someone had fallen. Alois ran to the balcony and looked down, stunned to see his own piece, Dennis, twitching on the ground. Ignoring the chaos, the Duke lifted Rachel into his arms and excused himself, while she anxiously reminded him of his leg. Held against him, Rachel stole a look at his profile, her mind still a mess from everything that just happened. Despite all her protests, Hubert kept his arms tight, holding his fiancée close as they walked out. The two of them walked out with their heads high, leaving behind the white-faced Viscount rooted to the spot. Rachel could not let go of one question. Why had he come? He was supposed to be with the king's guests. The Duke only turned away, leaving her his cold back, walking on without a word of explanation. From his point of view, right after leaving her for the Great Hall, his eyes had caught something wrong. He saw Verunia slip into the hall the moment Rachel left it. That smile set off every alarm in his head. Cut to Dennis, wrapped head to toe in white plaster, groaning in bed, furious that the plan had shattered. Alois arrived with contempt in his eyes, snapping at his useless underling to shut his mouth. Dennis fired back hotly, cursing Alois to his face for promising that splitting those two would be simple. The answer to that rage was two flat words from the Viscount's expressionless mouth. Be quiet. Alois added a few more cuts, telling him to stop shifting blame, since all of it came from his own incompetence. Bitter at losing his prize, Alois ground his teeth, determined not to let Rachel slip out of his hands. His face went dark as he promised himself he would have that woman no matter what. A few days after the disastrous party, Rico was calmly taking tea and cake with Viscount Alois in the drawing room. Alois fished, asking whether anyone had warned the boy about the wedding. As expected, Rico shook his head. Rico looked down and admitted he was stunned when the Duke appeared, and hurt that his sister hid something so large. Alois was quietly delighted and kept working on him, whispering that Rachel was being deceived since the pace was abnormal. Rico innocently asked why his cousin objected, since marrying into a ducal house clearly lifted the whole family. Alois poured it into his ear that a house's value lies in knowledge and money, and handing it to outsiders is foolish. The boy's face suddenly hardened as he asked pointedly whether his sister should settle for some useless man from Alois's branch. Slapped in the heart by a child, Alois broke out in a sweat, stammering, his false smile twisting out of shape. Rico thought that if the man had claimed concern for his sister, he would have accepted it. Instead, his ambition showed. Cut to Rachel, resplendent in an emerald gown, walking quietly down the corridor of the estate. Inside, she was seething, cursing Rena for surely taking a bribe to hide the fact that Alois had come. Then she stopped outside a door, pressing her ear to the wall as she caught the conversation between Rico and that cousin. Through the crack, her heart tore listening to her little brother expose the vultures waiting for him to die. Seeing Alois step out, Rico startled and said his name, then glanced over to see what his sister had heard. She turned and fixed Alois with a glare, asking pointedly what business brought him here without any appointment. Alois laughed it off and said with false warmth that families should not treat each other like strangers. Inside, she told herself that this whole tangled mess must never become Rico's burden to carry. To draw the danger off her brother, she smiled politely and invited her cousin out to the garden for a walk. A few steps in, she cut him off. The matter was settled. She was marrying Duke Hubert, and no one would change that. Alois grimaced, demanding to know why she would throw herself at a Duke of Demon Blood who was rumored to be unhinged. Seeing her go quiet, Alois softened his voice into the gentle brother again, saying all of this was only concern for her. She steered the talk to Rena. Alois blankly said he only recalled a brown-haired girl, and she laughed inwardly at the act. She threw out a smokescreen, accusing Rena of stealing birthday gifts, then asked how her dear cousin would handle it. Alois casually suggested she throw the girl into the street, since after all she was only a servant. Now was the time. She said plainly that because of that theft, she had quietly put a tail on the girl. She exposed the ball night. Rena left the house and ran straight to Verunia land. Alois began to sweat. She raised an eyebrow, seeing right through him, and remarked lightly that she could not imagine why the girl went so far. She told him flatly there was no misunderstanding. He had clearly planted Rena as his eyes inside her house. She recounted that night exactly, the girl running to report and stopping his carriage. Some things she knew better than she should. The reel of her past life surged back, Alois losing his temper and dragging her into a dark corner. His face in that memory was so black that merely seeing it again chilled her down the spine. The image of dying on his blade flashed through her mind, but she steadied herself since it was broad daylight. Right on cue, as Alois moved to try something, Hubert appeared, locked his arm, and ordered him to let her go. He stood there imposing, platinum hair and burning red eyes, radiating a presence that flattened anyone facing him. He looked at her reddened wrist, then turned a cold stare on Alois, mocking a man who could not measure himself. The Duke warned Verunia that from now on, if he could not restrain himself, he should come to him instead. Once Alois was out of sight, a servant swiftly brought up a first aid box and offered it to the Duke. The steward exhaled at arriving in time. She smiled inwardly, having planned to meet in the garden where help was near. She shyly refused when the Duke insisted on bandaging her himself, but he simply told her to sit still. His rough hands wrapped the bandage expertly. He said such scratches were nothing compared to a battlefield. Then she glimpsed Rico peeking from behind a bench and asked why he was hiding instead of coming to greet them. Pulling her brother into the light, she smiled with pride and formally introduced Rico to the Duke. At their first meeting, Rico stared wide-eyed, stunned to find the Duke had red eyes exactly like his own. The Duke offered his hand and gave his name, Ghislain Hubert, and Rico answered clearly in turn. Looking at that large hand, Rico hesitated, because you cannot trust a stranger instantly over a title. But when he looked up, his defenses dissolved before the rare warmth of the man's smile. The Duke called the boy the head of House Raroba and asked his blessing. The promise he was about to make would cost him blood. Treated with that respect, Rico's eyes lit up. He would agree only if the Duke swore to protect his sister. He took that small hand and swore on his own life that he would protect her to the end. Her chest ached as she realized both her brother and her future husband had quietly accepted their own deaths. But she recovered her smile at once, swearing to the heavens that this tragedy would not repeat, even if it killed her. Cut to a dark alley where Rena stamped and cursed at being thrown out over a few trinkets. Her destination that night was a large estate on the edge of town, lit up bright as daylight. She hammered on the door, wailing Viscount Alois's name, hoping to grab the last rope available to her. But the only answer was a silent wooden door and not a single soul in sight. On the upper floor, Alois stood behind the window looking down coldly at a pawn who had run out of value. His mind only replayed the morning, being crushed by the Duke, and the memory alone burned with humiliation. That man had forced a coward like him to swallow his fury and abandon the plan to wreck the wedding. Cold to the marrow, he waved a hand and ordered his steward to clear the noise from his gate. Exactly 1 month later, the bride Rachel appeared radiant in a spotless white wedding gown. Elsewhere, the Duke held a closed meeting with his retainer, giving him free rein to investigate the new bride. He ordered close surveillance on his wife's relatives and announced he would bring Rico into the estate to raise him. His man smiled with satisfaction, agreeing that his lord's move here was flawless in every direction. The Duke was certain that if Rico survived the illness, the boy would one day be the pillar of House Raroba. The aide congratulated him on finally leaving bachelorhood, and guessed his lady mother must be delighted. At that, the Duke turned away and said bitterly that his mother could not care less about this wedding. Back at the chapel, Rico came trotting up to call his sister, who stood beside her husband. The young groomsman wore a neat suit with a flower at his chest, though his darting eyes betrayed his nerves. She thanked him warmly for making the effort to come. Rico insisted nothing could keep him from his sister's wedding. The boy stole glances at his brother-in-law, admiring his bearing and quietly taking him as a model to follow. Catching that look of admiration, the Duke ruffled his hair and declared him officially his little brother now. Rico clung to his sister, sulking and grumbling at his brother-in-law for rushing the wedding like this. Her eyes lowered. She knew they had to sprint, because this man had exactly 1 year left. Looking at her groom, she painfully reviewed her last life. The disease would consume him unless she moved fast. Caught staring, Hubert gently asked what was wrong. She quickly waved it off and said it was nothing. Burying those dark thoughts away, she smiled brightly and took her husband's hand toward the altar. In the middle of the chapel, the priest began the rites and read both names aloud. His voice filled the room as he read the vows and asked whether they would stay together until death. Before all those watching eyes, both of them answered yes cleanly, without a second of hesitation. At the formalities, the priest scanned the room and asked whether anyone objected to this marriage. Looking over the pews, he met several nobles wearing sour faces, as if they had just lost everything. A few others frowned openly, a quiet warning about the old grudges running under high society. When the servant carried up the brocade box, she thought again of the ducal privilege of a jeweled crown for great occasions. Once the veil was lifted, she told herself to squeeze everything she could out of this one chance. The Duke handled it like an egg, setting the glittering crown gently onto his wife's pink hair. The two of them signed the register in turn, formally binding their two lives together. The priest called the witness forward, and her brother stepped up with dignity to take on that heavy duty. The moment Rico appeared, the crowd rustled, full of jabs about the disease that once wounded the boy. Watching her brother's small back from behind, her chest tightened with a feeling she could not name. Seeing how confident her brother had become, her eyes shone with unmistakable pride. A lady with platinum hair and deep violet stepped up, and the room buzzed that this was Lady Natalie. Rachel was struck by the beauty of her legendary mother-in-law, flawless exactly as the rumors described. Strangely, the Duke's face froze over, indifferent, as if his mother could do whatever she liked. He did not greet her at all, only urging the priest to finish, leaving the poor man flustered and sweating. The priest recovered and announced that the two were now husband and wife, the union made law. The hall erupted. The couple walked down the aisle hand in hand through falling petals and shouted blessings. He told his wife to ignore his mother's attitude. Even he was surprised, since she normally never left her villa. Red-eye disease is a cruel seed planted in children who breathe in miasma while still in the womb. Mothers under that curse often withdraw or abandon the child. Her curiosity about her mother-in-law only grew. The peace did not last long before the chapel bells suddenly rang out like an alarm. Mixed into the bells were screams from outside, leaving her bewildered about what was happening. Looking out to the courtyard, a flock of enormous winged monsters with hideous faces was diving into the crowd. She froze, wondering where they came from. Just then, a large beast came straight at her. At the last possible second, the Duke caught the monster by the throat one-handed and calmly said it was only a small one. He crushed it without emotion. The crowd was terrified, then went right back to whispering about his demon blood. While the knights cleared the field, a few loud mouths were already blaming the mess on two red-eyed people gathering. In her splendid gown, the bride stared after her husband's back, while his cold gaze made everyone shrink away. She suspected someone had sabotaged the wedding, then dismissed it, since no one could command monsters so precisely. The groom coldly urged her to move. She exhaled, her first goal achieved. She was free of Aloise's claim. Night settled slowly over the vast estate of Duke Hubert. The maids busied themselves preparing the new mistress, adding a touch of fragrant oil to her skin. She startled, slowly realizing that all this careful grooming was preparation for a wedding night. Looking at the delighted faces around her, she guessed none of them knew the truth behind this marriage. That it was in fact a contract of mutual benefit, spelled out down to the last figure. She remembered his cold warning that they were only partners. Tonight would prove how wrong that was. Drifting along in her own thoughts, she jumped at a knock that tore through the silence. The door opened and her jaw nearly dropped to find the Duke himself standing there in person. Her face flushed as her mind raced through every possible theory about why he had come. Breaking the awkwardness between them, he haltingly said he wanted to discuss their future together. But he stopped mid-sentence, red eyes narrowing as he caught just how tense she had become. Reading the signal wrong, the Duke decided to talk tomorrow instead and moved quickly to leave. But the moment his hand touched the handle, his face darkened. It had been locked from outside. He hammered on the door, shouting at the steward Briac for locking them in. Only then did the bride learn who was behind it. She quietly relaxed, realizing her contract husband was honest after all and had no designs in coming here. Outside, the old steward stood guard with folded arms, congratulating himself on forcing them to consummate the marriage. Ignoring the protesting fists on the door, he left them a wish for a pleasant night and strolled away. Accepting that his own household had cornered him, the Duke dropped his hands, his face full of irritation. Out of options, he announced he would climb out the window, which sent his wife scrambling to stop him. She reminded him how humiliating it would be if the world heard the Duke fled out a window on his wedding night. Trying to keep a straight face, she still found it funny to see this normally cold man so flustered. He raised the white flag and asked whether they would open the door in the morning. She could only nod and hope so. He clicked his tongue and said they should just sleep, since the bridal bed was wide enough for two corners. He smoothed his hair, telling himself neither of them had any interest in this, so the situation meant nothing. They each took a side. He pulled out a book to pass the time while she curled up defensively. Seeing him composed again, she shyly asked about the matter he had wanted to discuss earlier. He glanced over, turned serious, and started complaining that they spoke to each other like strangers. He argued that if they did not change that, gossip would start and the door would be locked again. She told him to go first. Cornered, she winced with embarrassment, swallowed hard, and called him by his given name, Ghislaine. Though he had promised to change how he addressed her, she noticed he had not once said her name aloud. He said he had monster duty tomorrow, but in exchange she could see the private laboratory prepared exactly as requested. At the mention of a dream workspace, her eyes lit up and she thanked the Duke warmly. They turned away to sleep. She felt awkward, since this was her first night sharing a bed with a strange man. Glancing at his broad back, she reminded herself this was a partnership, and romance had no place in it. Her reason was iron, yet somehow she remained acutely aware of the overwhelming presence beside her. The owl calls outside the window were suddenly drowned out by heavy, ragged breathing inside the dark room. She woke to the sound of a pained groan from the far side of the bed. Startled upright in the dark, she frantically called his name to find out what had happened. In the dim light, she screamed at the sight of that powerful body writhing in agony. Green veins stood out across skin slick with sweat, proof that his disease had flared violently. She shouted, trying to hold on to whatever thin thread of his reason was left in the seizure. In a flash, she lunged for the box of antidote she had kept ready for exactly this. Holding the vial in her hand, she trembled and muttered that this was the only lifeline he had. She threw herself down, pried his mouth open, and forced the bitter medicine into the half-conscious man. But in his agony, he thrashed and knocked the precious vial flying, while she watched in horror. Looking at the last drops, she gritted her teeth and swore to force it into him, or they would all die. Reckless as it was, she tipped the vial into her own mouth, murmuring that he should not blame her for what came next. Out of choices, she bent down and sealed her lips over his to pass him every drop of that medicine. The forced kiss ended. She screamed his name in desperation, praying the drug would take effect quickly. Adrift in a hazy subconscious, he vaguely sensed someone risking everything to pull him back from death. His mind floated somewhere distant, smiling bitterly that he was never lucky enough for anyone to truly worry about him. Memories returned of years spent shunned by other children who looked at him in fear, like a monster. The harsh lessons of adults had forced him to become cruel to survive, and never to beg for pity. The young Ghislaine retreated into a cold shell, using those red eyes to warn off anyone who came near. Even the person closest to him left, convinced that separation was the best escape for them both. The whispers and sneers about the demon blood in his veins followed him through his entire youth. He drowned in solitary pain, but the one person willing to reach for him lay only a few steps away. Through the darkness of his subconscious, her anguished voice rang out, drawing those red eyes slowly open. Waking, an instinctive hunger for warmth made him reach out and clamp his arms around the small, trembling figure. The bride's eyes went wide and her whole body went rigid in that powerful embrace. Pressed against his chest, she heard his heartbeat steady and exhaled in relief that the medicine had worked. But his body still burned like a furnace, the heat washing over her until her face went scarlet. Motionless in his arms, she panicked inside, imagining how he would react to learning she had kissed him. She buried her face in his broad shoulder, praying that by morning he would forget the whole mess. Under the moonlight, the two slept in each other's arms, closing a stormy but peaceful wedding night. He woke the next morning, and unfortunately the memory of that medicine-passing kiss replayed in perfect detail. Looking at his small wife still asleep in his arms, he was stunned, his head full of question marks. Sweat broke out as he covered his face, with no idea how to face her without dying of embarrassment. Setting aside that awkward morning, all three gathered around the table again, brother and sister greeting each other warmly. Remembering last night's agreement, she smiled and said good morning, using her husband's given name aloud. Still self-conscious about it, he stammered a few words and awkwardly asked whether she had slept well. While she nodded calmly, Rico chewed his bread and stared at the strange atmosphere between the two of them. Catching his own slip, the Duke cleared his throat, recovered his composure, and changed the subject. He announced his intention to bring in a first-rate tutor to give his brother-in-law a proper education. He handed over the very teacher who had taught him. He was building the boy a future he knew he would not see. At the idea of studying under his brother-in-law's tutor, Rico's eyes lit up and he asked if it was really for him. He nodded and threw in a retainer to teach swordsmanship, which thrilled the boy and worried him about his health. Seeing him hesitate, he reassured Rico that sword work was only for strength, not for hunting monsters. Moved by that kindness, Rico bowed his thanks and shyly called him brother-in-law for the first time. With the household settled, he told his wife his monster clearing schedule and handed the keys to her and the head maid. The moment he was gone, Rico gushed about his brother-in-law for letting him touch a sword he had only dreamed of. She understood that a red-eyed man still respected by the world, like Ghislain, would be an enormous anchor for Rico. Soon after, the head maid Hortense appeared, congratulating them properly and presenting herself to the new mistress. The bride smiled and returned the courtesy. The housekeeper bowed and asked to show her around the estate. Walking the corridor, she quietly observed and judged Hortense to be a housekeeper of absolute principle. The servants were cleaning, but every time the mistress passed, they stopped and whispered among themselves. At last they arrived. Hortense threw open a door and introduced her private laboratory, leaving Rachel speechless. Before her lay an enormous space packed with towering shelves and a workbench beyond anything she had imagined. Delighted, she asked the housekeeper whether demanding a laboratory as a new bride seemed strange to everyone. The housekeeper clicked her tongue and answered plainly that the Duke had married a rather unstable woman. She privately agreed, aware the title of mistress sat heavily on her, but research would always be her true love. Counting that Ghislain had a year left, she resolved to produce results and asked the housekeeper to handle the household. Hortense nodded in understanding, then quietly asked one question. Once the work was done, where would she go? Rachel went still for a beat, her eyes lowering, then smiled and said whatever Ghislain wanted, she would accept. Mid-sentence, a knock came. A servant reported that an urgent letter had arrived from House Riroba. She broke the seal on Steward Rodri's letter with a knot in her stomach, afraid something had gone wrong at home. A few lines in, her expression changed, her eyes widening as if she had read something impossible. Learning the old house had been robbed the night before, she called for a horse and rode out immediately. The crested carriage tore off like a storm, carrying her back home through the blistering afternoon heat. Running into the hall with her skirts in her hands, she called for Rodri and the maid Gray in alarm. The two servants bowed their heads in apology, but what the thief left behind nearly destroyed the whole house. The steward urged her to take inventory and see what was missing, and she nodded and hurried off. The study door swung open onto a battlefield, books and papers scattered across the entire floor. The classified material was hidden well, so a thief would gain nothing, but the wreckage still made her head spin. Cleaning up, she guessed these thieves had not targeted anything specific and had simply ransacked the place. Then her eye caught an odd little gap tucked away at the back of the wooden bookshelf. Following that trace, she was startled to find a box hidden so carefully no one could have guessed. On its lid was a 5-pointed star, a symbol heavy with the scent of black magic. Brushing off the thick dust, she read the title with wide eyes, An Investigation into Monsters and Demon Dens. The first pages were full of strange characters and grotesque drawings. She wondered what a demon den even was. Recognizing her father's handwriting, she went numb. This was no research journal. It described how to summon monsters. She broke into a sweat. If this secret surfaced, they were finished, and she could not fathom why her father touched it. A sudden knock startled her, and she shoved the book into a drawer in a flash. The door opened, and Ghislain appeared, his face both concerned and carrying that familiar cold authority. He asked after the situation at her old house, having received a report from his own people. She kept her expression flat and lied that the thief had only rummaged and taken nothing. Ghislain offered to station Hubert guards there, but she brushed it off, saying Riroba could manage on its own. She thought it would be foolish to drag Ghislain into this mud, and if her father was guilty, she had to hide it completely. Still lost in her own speculation, she jumped a second time when Ghislain suddenly spoke. He said her name softly, replacing Riroba with Hubert, a very quiet way of claiming her. He looked at her calmly and told his young wife to stop trying to carry everything alone. Her eyes widened, stunned by a warmth she never expected from a husband usually cold as ice. He stroked her hair and asked in a low voice the real reason she chose this marriage, then waited patiently. Ghislain told her to use anything of his she needed, from his authority to his men. She said his name softly, feeling her heart lurch at a sincerity that went well past what she expected. After that conversation, she shut herself in her room for a full week decoding her parents' journal. The more carefully she read, the more the chill down her spine rose until she could not suppress it. It turned out the monsters climbed up through tears in space, in places thick with miasma. The book even spelled out how to cultivate a demon den, as if the two of them had wanted to create one. She broke into a sweat. This research had to be on the forbidden list, and exposure would mean ruin. She reached the section on a flower that blooms inside a demon den, and the following pages had been torn out. She carried the book around the room, wondering who tore them out, or whether her father destroyed them himself. Looking out the window to clear her head, she happened to see Rico drilling with a sword in the yard. The disaster 5 years ago flooded back. If her parents had helped cause it, this house was finished. She was terrified that if the truth came out, House Roroba would certainly lose its noble title outright. Worse still, if this ever exploded, her husband's House of Hubert would be dragged down with them. Even with her parents' spotless reputation, she resolved to dig this whole mess up by the roots. Stepping into the empty corridor, she stopped short at the sound of dishes shattering somewhere ahead. Tracing the sound to Ghislaine's room, she immediately thought of him convulsing on the floor again. Without another second of thought, she slammed straight through the door and into the room. What met her eyes was Ghislaine clutching his chest, thrashing on the cold tile floor. She rushed to him and called his name, begging him to hold on just a little longer. The reek of alcohol from the scattered bottles told her he had been numbing the pain with drink. How long had he hidden this? She hurriedly told him to lie still and wait while she ran to fetch his painkiller. Half-conscious, Ghislaine rasped her name. Rachel answered at once, promising him that she was right there. But the instant she turned to go, his arm, black veins standing out, clamped around her wrist like a vice. Ghislaine begged her not to leave but to stay and treat him, admitting his endurance had run out. Before she could understand what was happening, he yanked her hard and she fell against his chest. Giving her no chance to react, Ghislaine kissed her fiercely in the middle of the raging attack. His red eyes burned with something feverish. He held her tight and whispered a question. Why? He pressed her into the corner and kissed her again and again, as if pouring all his torment into her. She pulled away, shaken, wondering if he still remembered that fateful night. The answer would come far later than she expected. Still lost in memory, Ghislaine suddenly collapsed, begging for medicine, and she screamed for help in terror. The steward arrived in time, apologizing and explaining that the Duke was too proud to ever ask for help. She blinked back tears. Of course. When he suffered worst, no one had ever bothered to look his way. Watching Ghislaine sink into sleep, still full of questions, she resolved to be worth the faith he had placed in her. The steward smiled faintly and excused himself, confirming that the lady would be staying to nurse him. He told her to shout if the seizures worsened. She nodded, agreeing this man clearly needed watching. Chin in hand, she decided that tomorrow's first task was clearing every bottle out of her husband's room. Sleep came before she could fight it off, and her eyes closed under the pale moonlight. Deep asleep, she was lifted by a pair of warm arms and set gently into the blankets of the large bed. The next morning, Ghislaine woke, his eyes softening as he watched his small wife sleeping soundly. She startled awake in complete panic, unable to understand how she ended up in bed beside him. Ghislaine apologized for the chaos of the night before, but she flushed and waved it off, saying she did not mind. She told him firmly that from now on he should say when it hurt instead of enduring it in silence. Then she put on a serious face and pressed him for the real reason he had signed the marriage papers. Ghislaine deflected, only giving her a deep look and repeating that she should stop carrying everything alone. He smiled gently and said one thing more, that her instincts about him had been entirely correct. Seeing him relaxed, she seized the moment and asked him to take his shirt off for an examination. Her ears went red as she grabbed his sleeve and insisted this was an extremely serious medical exam. In the end, Ghislaine obediently removed his shirt and let her take his pulse at the wrist. He watched her with open skepticism, speechless at a bedside manner unlike any he had seen. She confidently produced a gleaming syringe, and Ghislaine protested that she was not even a doctor. She boasted her blood draws were so smooth Rico never flinched, while Ghislaine kept leaning away. With the draw finished, she pressed cotton to the site and told him to hold it down firmly. She moved on to analysis, asking when the black bruises appeared. He said they had spread 5 years ago. She was stunned that this man had quietly endured such a cruel disease for all those years. The progression was faster than expected. The previous Duke lived to 30, while last life Rico was critical at 12. She embraced him, guessing the old Duke's strength kept him going. The real problem was the buried medical records. Piecing everything together, she realized that in this life Rico had no black bruises at all. which meant the boy had never been ravaged by the disease. He was being poisoned by Alois. Seeing his wife go distant again, Ghislain asked gently whether something was troubling her. She waved it off, then disinfected the scratch on his neck, swearing to miss nothing this time around. The medical tray held every kind of blade and vial, a sign of harder things about to arrive. She gathered up her courage and approached him with a serious face to discuss something important. She declared they were done sleeping in separate rooms, given the terrifying seizures of the night before. Ghislain flushed instantly and mumbled, trying to find an excuse to escape such a bold proposal. But under her sharp and completely unwavering gaze, he slowly began to sweat. In the end, he simply nodded and gave in to his wife's demand to keep the peace. As he was leaving for work, she called after him to ask if the Duke was hunting monsters again today. He nodded and complained that the beasts in the forest had been expanding their territory lately. He said he had to thin them out in daylight, while her mind had already drifted to the notes about that forest. Curiosity pushed her toward a reckless idea. She had to go there once and see it for herself. So she half-jokingly asked to come along, which made him whip around and question her at once. He refused because the deep forest was badly contaminated, but she insisted, to test her theory linking the disease and the beasts. She hurried to cover with an excuse about gathering herbs, leaving the Duke without a word. Ghislain raised a suspicious eyebrow and asked if she had also been gathering herbs the night they met. The memory of him drenched in blood came back, and she realized guiltily that he had been holding on to that. She laughed it off and agreed. She did not expect that Forrest was about to return the memory she lost when she died. Seeing that look, Ghislain sighed and let her come, deciding it was safer to keep her at his side. Watching her walk away, he blamed himself for playing the cold man badly, because her pull was simply too strong. He admitted it was not that he doubted her, only that he feared building up too much hope and being crushed. His face darkened as he realized every seizure was a slap, reminding him that his time was almost gone. The camera pans to the Miasma Forest, cradle of the disaster 5 years ago, a black swamp of a place. The young couple rode in with the Hubert Knights under his command, the men who handled the hardest cases. The whole column filed in one behind another, feeling their way into the dense darkness of the woods. On arrival, Ghislain helped her down and asked whether the poisonous air made it hard for her to breathe. He also reminded her that her parents had fallen to beasts that came out of this very nest. Hearing him mention their deaths, she went silent for several seconds, shock plain on her face. Even with her heart aching, she forced herself to look strong and told him she was fine. Her parents entered the forest during an outbreak, but the more she read her father's journal, the more she doubted it was an accident. That catastrophe took not only her family, but also a number of knights from the Verunia Legion sent as reinforcements. Standing in this ruin, her instincts told her the tragedy had been arranged, not simply bad luck. The area fell quiet, leaving only the labored breathing of a knight resting after the fight. Lost in thought, she was interrupted by the knight Anban, cheerfully showing off a monster core he had cut out. Anban explained that if these cores were not brought back and purified, they would grow into enormous plague seeds. Another comrade came over and kindly pressed a sprig of herb into her hand, and it looked valuable. Her eyes lit up, and she pressed Sir Hector on whether this was exactly the plant she had been hunting. A small gift with a large heart. She gave him a brilliant smile in place of 1,000 thanks. Looking around this poisonous wilderness, she conceded one truth. The deeper you go, the rarer the medicine. She was about to walk on when Ghislain threw out an arm and forbade her from taking another step. He said gravely that ahead lay an enormous monster nest, one even the seasoned Hubert Knights avoided. At the words demon nest, her face shifted slightly, because fear was starting to set in. He admitted that if anything went wrong, even he could not handle it, and told her to pack up and go home. Then out of nowhere, a faintly glowing flower caught her eye deep in the underbrush. The instant her gaze touched that strange flower, her head split with pain and she clutched at it. Fragments of memory flashed through her mind, a dark scene with herself and a Ghislain she did not recognize. In that memory, his ghost left behind an ice-cold line, mocking the fact that she still had her life. The pain left her reeling, shaken by the realization that she had truly lived through that moment. She muttered, piecing together the demon nest and that flower, while he lunged to catch her collapsing body. Unable to bear the roaring in her skull, she moaned a few times and lost consciousness. In the middle of that poisoned forest, Ghislain shouted her name and swept her up in a panic. She woke to a soft bed, with him berating the old physician for failing to fix her. The old doctor tearfully explained that the lady had likely suffered heat shock and exhaustion from the journey. He pressed hard on whether the forest miasma was involved, and thankfully the old man swore it was not. Feeling sorry for how frantic he was, she weakly said Gislin's name and assured him she was better now. The tension eased once the old physician tactfully withdrew, leaving the two of them alone. Even so, the Duke was not satisfied, gently laying a hand on her forehead to check her temperature again. She smiled and answered him, still calculating whether that terrible pain had come from the memories. She wondered what exactly she had glimpsed before she died, and in a blink, several days had passed. A timid maid carried in a thick stack of letters and shyly asked for a moment of her time. She flipped through them with visible weariness, since more than half were dull tea invitations from the rich. Then her eye stopped on a violet envelope with gilt trim, unmistakably from Lady Natalie herself. Her mother-in-law praised her skill with red-eye disease and handed over control of the orphanage entirely. More shocking still, the lady declared she would cover every expense with funding available on request. Still stunned, the servant added more about the home that took in children with terminal illnesses. The secret came out. The steward admitted the Duke knew nothing at all about what his mother was doing. Curious as she was about why the lady hid it from her own son, the servant's mouth stayed shut. The steward reasoned that this handover meant Lady Natalie was ready to tell Gislin the whole truth. Thinking like a physician, she asked after the orphans and whether any of them were in critical condition. On hearing the answer, she decided to leave at once to bring the medicine to those failing children. Sharing the carriage, Gislin honestly confessed that he knew nothing at all about his mother's quiet charity. She sighed for that cold relationship, wishing they would set their pride aside and simply talk. The carriage stopped before the imposing gate of a clean, well-kept home for the unluckiest of lives. Something hard to name lit in Gislin's eyes as he saw his mother's life work for the first time. A kind matron came out to greet them, leading the way and insisting the children here were as rowdy as any others. The sound of children laughing was living proof of the ducal family's generosity and constant care. The further they toured, the more she admired the immaculate facilities and the lady's devotion to these patients. She was certain that behind that icy exterior, this mother had never stopped worrying about her son. The mood dropped when the group turned into a dark corridor, leaving her curious about what lay inside. The matron hesitated and said that behind the door was the isolation wing for cases that would not recover. Her instincts as a healer flared. She brushed past the staff's timid objections and insisted on going in. With confidence and real compassion, she promised she could salvage something for those fragile lives. The door opened onto a heartbreaking scene, a young boy convulsing on the cold stone floor. The disease had wrecked the young body, green and black veins bulging, while he clawed his own throat raw. Gislaine wasted no words, lunging to restrain the boy and telling her to get the medicine out immediately. The two worked in perfect rhythm, he holding the patient down while she poured in drops of the blue medicine. Even with the seizure stopped, she worried, because the black marks on the boy showed no sign of fading. Suddenly, the boy's bloodshot eyes rolled up and he snarled at her, demanding to know what she had given him. The boy said something that left her frozen. He would rather drink poison than live half dead like this. A bitter smile crossed his lips. He had surrendered, accepting that this disease could not be cured. That look of a boy done with living hit her where it hurt, reminding her of Rico and years of helplessness. Understanding that pain, she sadly told the caretakers to honor his wish if he truly wanted release. Just as they turned for home, the rain came down in sheets, matching his dark face and weighing on the whole frame. Luckily, they found an old hunter's cabin and decided to pull in and wait out the storm. Inside, he quickly lit a fire. The two of them dropped down side by side, exhausted, to dry off. Seeing her shivering, curled in a blanket, he asked after her and laid another coat over her for warmth. The silence drew her out, and she spoke about the boy from earlier. Tonight he would say the thing he kept buried deepest. Tears falling, she confessed her deepest fear, that saving people might only push them into longer suffering. Facing a woman that badly wounded, his eyes softened with something very close to grief. Throwing off his restraint, he pulled her into his arms and said warm things to steady that breaking heart. Rachel sobbed, remembering his warning that marrying him might leave her full of regret. The irony was cruel. Gislin answered that if she feared regret, he had tasted it first, since half a cure only made the pain worse. Holding her tight, he admitted that only since bringing her home had he learned to fear death, and now he had to gamble. Rachel looked up at him with brimming eyes, while Ghislaine's large hand gently lifted her chin. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, a quiet comfort for the small wife crying in his arms. His red eyes burning with resolve, he swore to stand behind her and asked her to see this road through with him. Hearing him lay everything bare, Rachel smiled through the tears still on her face and gave a small nod. In the pouring rain, Alois stood before his old teacher's grave, murmuring the words he was once given, to stand by Rachel and protect Riroba. He smiled faintly through the rain, telling himself he had never once dared forget that instruction. Cut back to the wife. That kiss on her forehead kept replaying in Rachel's head. Something was taking root. Rachel stood blankly in her study, racking her mind over what her husband's gesture actually meant. He clearly had not been drunk, yet he had been that gentle on purpose, and her heart would not settle. Staring at the mysterious journal, she still could not shake the thought that her parents had touched something forbidden. She shook her head to clear it, telling herself romance was forbidden right now. Hurry, and lives could be saved. Rachel clenched both fists, but what waited for her in the royal library would demolish everything she thought she knew. Out in the garden, Ghislaine was playing the strict instructor, drilling Rico hard in his swordsmanship. Exhausted from a full day of work, Rachel yawned and muttered that she should sleep early for once. Entering the room, she regretted having suggested sharing a bed, though the point was to watch for his attacks. Stepping softly as a cat, she peeked to see whether her husband had already fallen asleep. Seeing him lying still and breathing evenly, she exhaled in relief, glad the pain had spared him tonight. Rachel lay down beside Ghislaine, and the two of them drifted into a peaceful sleep under the moon. But at midnight, her husband quietly opened those mysterious red eyes. He had only been pretending to sleep. A few days later, the whole household was gathered at breakfast in a warm, easy atmosphere. Rico noticed at once that his sister had been up all night, but she laughed it off as a late bedtime. Ghislaine seized the opening and sided with Rico, insisting she take care of herself over her protests. The steward added that working herself to death like this would only make her productivity fall. True to his word, he produced theater tickets prepared in advance to force her out for a break. Rico eagerly urged his sister to go, sulking that his own training schedule kept him at home. Given a golden opening, Ghislaine locked in the date before Rachel could get a word of refusal out. He looked at her fondly and told her to nap first so she would have energy for the theater. Out of excuses, Rachel smiled and agreed, though privately she may have been looking forward to it. That evening, the two of them walked hand in hand into a theater blazing with light. The audience applauded around them, the whole hall steeped in an atmosphere thick with art. When it ended, Ghislaine pronounced it not bad, while his wife raved about the soprano's voice. He suddenly confessed that this was in fact the first time in his life he had ever been to the theater. Then he rested his chin on his hand and said marriage had opened up all sorts of new experiences, and Rachel went scarlet. Overcome with embarrassment, she stood quickly and excused herself to fix her makeup and escape that look. Seeing her flushed face in the mirror, she muttered that her husband's smile kept setting her on fire. This was infatuation. Coming out into the crowded lobby, Rachel stood adrift among the press of people. Then she froze in place, goose flesh rising as a chill ran straight down her spine. She spun around. Her instincts insisted that dozens of scrutinizing eyes were fixed on her. Even as she told herself it was only nerves, the alarm on her face was impossible to hide. Cut to outside the theater, where a fountain glittered brightly under the night sky. Rachel enthusiastically praised the play and said she wanted to thank Briac. He agreed the old man would be delighted. The two of them left the theater at an easy pace, walking toward the waiting carriage. Sir Hector was already there. Ghislaine asked why, since no one had called for a guard. Rachel anxiously asked what had happened. Ghislaine went still on hearing that monsters had appeared nearby. Hector quickly reassured them that the Hubert Knights had already gone to clear the beasts out. Hearing that, Rachel closed her eyes and exhaled, letting some of the weight off her chest. The carriage carried the two of them smoothly and safely back to the estate. The maids and staff stood in neat rows, bowing to welcome their master and mistress home. Hector hesitantly reported some irregularities in the Knights' ledgers that needed Ghislaine's personal review. Reading between the lines at once, Ghislaine's face tightened, and he gave a short nod. He turned to his wife and told her to go in first, and Rachel obediently did as he asked. Once she was out of sight, Ghislaine asked outright what he did not want his wife to hear. Hector sighed and nodded. Hector said rumors were spreading that House Roroba was tied to the monsters flooding the city. Ghislaine went silent. Idle people had seized on the beasts appearing the same day the siblings did and spun conspiracy theories. Thinking of Rachel smiling gently at Rico while he read, it was clear how vicious the slander truly was. Hector continued that the world was pointing at Roroba as the house that brought disaster on the kingdom. The pair's closeness was a slap in the face of that gossip. Hector said grimly that someone was deliberately seeding it. Ghislaine flew into a rage, eyes going ice cold, demanding that those spreading the filth be dealt with. He cursed the idle rich who invented stories, then banned a single word of it from reaching Rachel or Rico. He also ordered his men to dig up the root of this malicious rumor no matter what. Hector struck his fist to his chest and accepted the order without a moment of hesitation. Days later, the mood turned grim as more and more monsters spilled out into the open. Rachel sat with her chin in her hand, sick with worry, since such chaos once meant the year of the disaster. Seeing his wife distracted again, Ghislaine came over and asked who had upset his lady. He said quietly that he could already read her and that the monsters had frightened her. Ghislaine slowly opened his hand and offered her something. He had prepared it since learning he could not stay with her. It turned out to be a protective bracelet set with jewels bright enough to hurt the eyes. He explained it could block 1 or 2 attacks, enough to make even a large monster hesitate. Seeing how precious it was, Rachel told him to keep it, since he was the one riding into danger. But Ghislaine refused, joking that a commander wearing a charm would be mocked, so she should hold it for him. She gave in and nodded, eyes shining. It was the last gift he managed to give her before everything broke. Learning he was heading into the forest, she panicked and said the woods must be far worse. He calmly said the deep forest was quiet. Ghislaine said he meant to investigate how the beasts were reaching the city, then told his wife to stay inside the estate. Rachel obeyed, staying home and burying herself in mountains of paperwork stacked across her desk. While she worked, a knock at the door made her jump and look up sharply. The steward poked his head in, apologized for interrupting, and solemnly announced a letter from the king. Rachel was stunned to see her own name written plainly across the front of it. She opened it and cried out. It was a pass into the restricted room of the royal library, surely from Lady Natalie. That was a forbidden section reserved for the royal family, and she might find an entire vault of knowledge inside. Rachel wanted to race to the library at once, but hesitated over whether she should ask her husband first. His instruction to stay home safely was still ringing loudly in her ears. The steward considered it. He knew perfectly well Ghislaine kept her home to shield her from the gossip. But seeing how her eyes lit up, he decided to keep that secret to himself. Setting his master's order aside, he approved her departure and promised her guards for the journey. The royal palace rose up ahead of her, dazzling in the afternoon sunlight. On the palace steps, Rachel held up the letter, gave her name clearly, and stated she had the king's special leave. The guards respectfully admitted the lady of House Hubert, though her escort could only reach the waiting room. Rachel walked up to the great door, ready to step into a space of absolute secrecy. The moment she pushed the door open, the sheer scale of the room took her breath away. Rows of enormous shelves reached the ceiling, holding the essence of all knowledge, glowing in the sun. Rachel threw herself into the hunt at once, her eyes bright with obsession. She buried herself in towering stacks of books and read until she lost all sense of time. After tearing through the entire library, she had to admit it held only familiar theory, and no trace of that flower. She told herself to calm down, wondering how her father would have handled a situation like this. She remembered his advice that a person should never be rigid, and that flexibility is what matters. Lost in thought, she stopped at the sight of a strangely glowing book on a shelf and moved closer in curiosity. Opening it, she murmured a guess that this might be a record of the kingdom's earliest age. The book told of an age of chaos, a dark era when grotesque monsters roamed everywhere. Fortunately, a saint descended, cleansed a stretch of land, and built a safe haven for humanity. But mercy did not reach everyone. Those left outside still lived half dead among the monsters each day. Unable to bear that injustice, one man rallied others, built walls against the beasts, and founded a small kingdom. The peace did not last. A legion of monsters thick as ants arrived to level everything. Refusing to watch his homeland fall, that hero charged alone into the monsters' lair and cleared them out. He won the battle, but he was spent, and he collapsed there on the open battlefield. Lying in a pool of blood waiting for death, The hero's fading eyes caught on something out of place. In the middle of a field littered with bones, a single flower had pushed up and burst into bloom. Reading that passage, she went rigid, all of her earlier composure gone in an instant. The illustration of that strange flower began to blur, seeping into her mind until she could not look away. Then a splitting pain drove through her skull and she clutched her head, moaning aloud. It was that same familiar headache. Her mind tore through every corner, hunting where she had seen this flower. Memory broke like a dam, showing her collapsed at the feet of a blond man with a cruel smile and a dripping knife. The man with the knife came closer, radiating a menace that left her suffocating and utterly hopeless. His silhouette among enormous spiked thorns burned itself into her mind like a blazing red warning. Reeling from those violent fragments, her hands opened and the precious book dropped to the floor. Her whole body collapsed. That flower was the last thing she saw before she died. But Alois killed her at the well. So who was the man with the knife among the thorns?